On October 1st, 2025 in New York City, the world expected another ordinary day. The United Nations was in session. Delegates moved quietly through the marble halls. Rows of flags hung still, each one representing a nation, each one a symbol of sovereignty, though many were weighed down by invisible chains of debt. It was supposed to be a routine meeting, another debate about debt restructuring. More papers, more speeches, more technical language that ordinary people would never hear. But that morning was different. That morning, a young soldier from a small country in West Africa stood and changed the rhythm of the hall. His name was Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, a nation often ignored in the corridors of global power, but a nation that carried the memory of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary who once declared that Africa would not bow, and who paid for his words with his life. Traoré was young. His jacket was plain, military green. There was no gold pin, no silk tie, no luxury watch. He was not dressed for compromise. He was dressed for truth. When the session began, the chairman introduced the debate. Delegates leaned forward with pens ready. Cameras adjusted their focus. IMF officials, seated near the front, prepared to defend their spreadsheets and policies. And then Traoré rose. He unfolded a piece of paper, but before looking at it, he lifted his head and stared directly at the guardians of global finance. His voice was steady, calm, but filled with steel. He said, "Africa owes you nothing." The chamber froze. The words hung in the air like thunder that refused to roll away. For decades, African leaders had spoken in the language of request. They had asked politely for aid. They had begged for relief. They had negotiated for crumbs. But this was different. This was defiance. It was David pointing his finger at Goliath, not with a stone, but with truth. And Traoré did not stop there. He began to list what he called the 7 crimes of the IMF in West Africa. He spoke first of Ghana and Ivory Coast. He reminded the world that Ghana was still chained to a $3 billion bailout from 2022, drowning in interest payments while its hospitals lacked medicine and its schools lacked teachers. Ivory Coast, too, carried heavy chains of debt, its future mortgaged to creditors who sat thousands of miles away. Then he spoke of Ghana's cocoa industry, once the pride of farmers, now stolen by privatization. The profits went overseas, the farmers were left with scraps. A nation that fed the world with cocoa could not feed its own children. Third, he turned to Mali and Senegal. IMF conditions demanded cuts to health and education. Budgets for doctors and teachers were slashed. Hospitals decayed. Children sat outside classrooms because there were no funds to keep the schools open. Fourth, he reminded the world of Nigeria in 1986. When the IMF forced the devaluation of the naira, the middle class collapsed overnight. Wages lost their value. Prices soared. Families fell into poverty. What was promised as stability became ruin. Fifth, he spoke of Liberia and Sierra Leone. IMF loans continued to flow into governments riddled with corruption. The citizens never saw the money. The people inherited mountains of debt, while the elites built palaces. Sixth, he turned home, to Burkina Faso. His voice sharpened. Under IMF guidance, his country was told to export raw gold instead of building industries. Multinational corporations grew rich, while Burkinabe families remained poor, watching their land stripped of treasure. Seventh, he ended with Niger. Under IMF pressure, the country opened its electricity and telecommunications to foreign investors. Strategic assets, vital to sovereignty, were sold away. Independence was traded for survival. As he finished, the silence grew thicker. The delegates shifted in their seats. IMF officials lowered their eyes, staring at papers they no longer believed in. And then he said the words that burned through the chamber. "This is not about money. This is about honor. This is about dignity." The silence held for a breath, and then the clapping began. It started with African delegations. One table, then another, then another. The sound grew louder, rolling like thunder through the hall. Delegates from Mali stood. Guinea followed. Niger, Senegal. They clapped, they shouted, they stood tall. But the IMF's row stayed frozen. Their silence was louder than any words they could have spoken. Outside the UN, the words spread like fire. Radios in Ouagadougou crackled. Africa owes you nothing. In Mali, mothers gathered their children around old radios, repeating the line as if it were a blessing. In Ghana, cocoa farmers raised fists in crowded cafes. In Liberia, people whispered that someone had finally spoken aloud what they had carried in their hearts for decades. Artists painted murals of Traoré's face beside Thomas Sankara, two soldier presidents bound across generations. People said, history is not repeating, history is continuing. His words reached classrooms where teachers wrote them in chalk on blackboards. They reached checkpoints where soldiers repeated them like prayers. They reached social media where hashtags spread from Dakar to Johannesburg. We owe nothing. Africa owes nothing. And across the Atlantic, the diaspora heard the echo. At Howard University in Washington, professors dissected Traoré's speech alongside Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. In Harlem, pastors repeated his words as sermons. In Atlanta, choirs sang his line, "This is about dignity, not money," as though it were scripture. For African Americans, for Caribbean communities, for the diaspora long waiting to hear a voice of strength from the continent, the moment was electric. For once, Africa was not seen as begging. Africa was demanding. The world reacted with unease. Washington called him reckless. Paris said he was dangerous. Brussels urged stability. But Moscow hailed him as heir to anti-colonial struggle. Beijing contrasted IMF austerity with its own no-strings loans, suggesting that Africa had other partners waiting. Back home, celebration filled the streets. Drums beat in Ouagadougou. Children painted slogans on walls. Teachers who had gone unpaid said hope gave meaning to their sacrifice. Market women said they would endure hunger if it meant freedom. Soldiers at dusty checkpoints repeated his words, "We owe nothing." But with celebration came fear. Analysts warned of punishment. Aid could be cut. Interest rates raised. Food programs shrunk. Ministers in Burkina Faso argued behind closed doors. Some urged retreat. Some urged bold new partnerships with Russia, China, or the BRICS bloc. But Traoré did not bend. Days later, in a televised address, he looked into the camera and said, "We do not ask permission to be free. We rise to claim it." At the African Union, leaders debated an African sovereignty fund, a pool of resources to replace dependence on creditors. For the first time in decades, unity had a tangible plan. Yet the risks were real. Hunger still lurked. Poverty still weighed heavy. Sanctions could fall. But something deeper had shifted. The silence of dependency was broken. The image of that day remains etched in memory. A young soldier president standing tall in the marble chamber of the United Nations. Behind him, the blue emblem of the UN. Before him, the silence of the IMF. And his words crack through it all. Africa owes you nothing. It is you who owe us the truth. That moment did not end when the applause stopped. It carried into classrooms, into sermons, into markets, into social media feeds, into songs and chants. Debt still exists. Hunger still threatens. Poverty still lingers. But belief has been born. Belief that dignity is not negotiable. The applause that day was not an ending. It was a beginning. And so the question lingers. Will this spark become a fire of unity? Or will it be crushed by the weight of empire? Will Africa stand firm? Or will punishment force silence again? No one knows. The answer has not yet been written. But the vow remains. The vow of dignity. As Traoré said, this fight is not about money. It is about dignity. And dignity cannot be measured in dollars. God bless Africa.